Few women in history dared to live as boldly as Daisy Warwick, a woman who scandalized an empire, seduced a prince, and transformed from glittering heiress to unapologetic rebel. An heiress at just 3, selected by Queen Victoria for a royal match, Daisy defied the Queen and instead became the mistress of his brother, the future King Edward VII. 4 children by 3 different men, all while married to one. She danced on the knife's edge of respectability, shattering conventions and scandalizing society. But Daisy didn't stop there. From dazzling the highest echelons of the aristocracy, she plunged headfirst into the fight for socialism and women's suffrage, campaigned as a Labour MP, and dared to blackmail the royal family with love letters from the king himself. This is not just a story of privilege. It's a tale of rebellion, reinvention, and the audacious life of a woman who refused to bow to anyone. From glittering ballrooms to fiery speeches and the ruins of her fading fortune, Daisy Warwick burned through her world like a comet, leaving scandal, heartbreak, and revolution in her wake, perhaps forever changing the course of the monarchy. If you like stories like this, please consider subscribing. As a small channel focusing on amazing women throughout history, your support really matters. And now let's get into the scandalous life of Daisy Warwick. Frances Evelyn Maynard, eternally and simply Daisy, came into the world on December 10, 1861, her name a whisper of innocence against the formidable weight of her lineage. Born into a Victorian age, gilded with privilege yet caged by rigid expectations, she was a child of contradictions, destined to both epitomize and rebel against the society that shaped her. Her father, the Honourable Charles Maynard, was the heir to Easton Lodge, a sprawling Essex estate steeped in pastoral beauty and aristocratic grandeur. Her mother, Blanche Fitzroy, bore the distinguished bloodlines of 2 royal bastards, descending from Charles II through the Grafton and St. Albans lines. Daisy's birth was not merely a family affair. It was the continuation of a dynasty, woven into the intricate tapestry of the British aristocracy. Her father, Charles, seemed less a man than a character sprung from the fevered imagination of a romantic poet. With fiery hair, blue eyes alight with mischief, and a Byronic flair for the dramatic, he lived as though life itself were a series of grand performances. Tales of his audacious exploits lingered like echoes through the halls of Easton Lodge. He once leapt his horse over a banquet table set with crystal and china, landing cleanly to the gasps of astonished guests. In Spain, he scandalized a bull ring by vaulting onto the back of a charging bull, eliciting both outrage and awe. Yet his appetite for spectacle was matched by a recklessness that courted ruin. For Daisy, he would remain a mythical figure, etched in childhood memories as larger than life and impossible to truly know. Her mother was the calm to Charles's tempest, a woman of unshakable poise whose quiet strength would come to define her role as matriarch. Tragedy struck in 1865 when Charles died suddenly, leaving her a widow at 28, with 3-year-old Daisy and her infant sister in her care. As if the gods had not exacted enough, the 3rd Viscount Maynard, Daisy's grandfather, died shortly thereafter, thrusting the young girl into the role of heiress to a vast fortune and legacy. At an age when most children were content chasing fireflies, Daisy inherited an estate that yielded £30,000 annually, a sum that would surpass £750,000 today. Her golden curls and wide, intelligent eyes made her a striking figure, but her newfound wealth turned her into a lightning rod for envy and intrigue. Jealousy brewed within the extended family, manifesting in pettiness that bordered on absurdity. When the Viscount's will was read, disinherited relatives could only express their resentment in the most childish of gestures, hurling pats of butter at his portrait in a moment of futile defiance. The episode became family lore, a stark reminder that privilege rarely came without its share of detractors. In 1866, Blanche remarried, choosing as her second husband the urbane and affable Lord Rosslyn. A man of quick wit and magnetic charm, Rosslyn held the rare distinction of entertaining Queen Victoria, coaxing laughter from the famously dour monarch with his sharp anecdotes. His presence transformed the Maynard household into a lively, bustling enclave, his 5 children from a previous marriage weaving their energy into the fabric of Daisy's young life. Yet for all its vitality, Victorian parenting remained a detached and exacting affair. Children were viewed less as individuals and more as ornaments, showcased at dinner parties, but largely relegated to the care of governesses. Daisy would later describe herself and her siblings as animate toys, charming curiosities brought out for display, but otherwise left to their own devices. Daisy's education, like her upbringing, reflected the rigid norms of her class. Lessons in French, German, and Italian were designed to polish her conversational grace, while piano scales and poetry recitation honed her feminine allure. Deportment was drilled into her until her posture rivaled the marble statues in the drawing room, her every movement a reflection of aristocratic discipline. Sundays were spent in the family chapel, where even the seating arrangements reflected the social hierarchies Daisy had already begun to question. How, she once pondered, could God regard the table of precedence with approval when all were said to be equal in his eyes? Beneath the veneer of aristocratic refinement, however, lay a restless mind. Daisy devoured books that extended far beyond her prescribed curriculum, immersing herself in history and philosophy with a hunger that belied her young age. She cultivated what she later called a just sympathy and an open mind, qualities that would guide her far beyond the gilded confines of Easton Lodge. In the grand halls of her childhood, every shadow seemed to whisper both privilege and burden, expectation and possibility. Even then, Daisy began to dream of a life that would not simply unfold as dictated by wealth or tradition, but one she might shape with her own will and conviction. Daisy's teenage years offered her a tantalizing glimpse into the glittering world of Victorian high society. One of these moments came during a visit to the famed artist Frank Miles's studio. Among canvases of aristocratic muses, Daisy encountered a woman who seemed to embody the era's ideal of beauty. Lily Langtry, the celebrated Jersey Lily, was the kind of beauty that defied Victorian convention. Her dark, glossy hair framed a face luminous with charm, and her bright, intelligent eyes seemed to invite secrets. She captivated everyone in the room, including Daisy, who couldn't help but be drawn to her effortless elegance and quick wit. Later, at Lord Rosslyn's invitation, Lily joined a dinner at their London home. There, as Daisy told it, Lily dazzled everyone with her effortless charm with her uninteresting fat husband in tow. For Daisy and her sisters, Lily was more than a visitor. She was a revelation. They adored her, leading her on pony rides and adorning her hats with flowers. Daisy would later reflect that she saw in Lily not just beauty, but a charisma that was almost otherworldly. Yet their friendship held an unspoken foreshadowing. The woman Daisy idolized in her youth would, years later, be eclipsed by Daisy herself, as she stepped into the role of the Prince of Wales's mistress, a position fraught with scandal and history. As Daisy grew older, her beauty began to draw attention in ways she had never anticipated. It came as a deep and almost incredible surprise to me, she wrote, to find in men's eyes an unfailing tribute to a beauty I myself had not been able to discern. Victorian fashions may have obscured youthful allure with frizzled hair and stiff gowns, but Daisy's golden hair, stormy blue eyes, and refined features made her stand out. While Lily Langtry radiated untamed allure, Daisy's beauty required refinement. Well-coiffed hair and elegant clothes brought her understated charm into full bloom. The first man to fall under her spell was Frances Greville, Lord Brooke, heir to the ancient earldom of Warwick. He was 23 when he met Daisy, then just 16. But the age gap did little to temper his infatuation. Within weeks, Brooke sought the permission of Daisy's parents to propose. However, Daisy's stepfather, Lord Rosslyn, had loftier ambitions. A close friend of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Rosslyn envisioned Daisy as a royal bride. Through Disraeli, Rosslyn ensured that Daisy came to the attention of Queen Victoria, who summoned her to Windsor Castle for a formal inspection. The visit to Windsor was as daunting as Daisy had feared. The air of formality was suffocating. the silence broken only by the soft clinking of silverware at a dinner where no one dared to laugh or speak above a whisper. Queen Victoria entered swiftly, her penetrating gaze assessing the young girl. After dinner, the Queen interrogated Daisy about her interests, music, art, her readiness for a public debut. Daisy, shy and uncertain, managed to answer, but she left Windsor feeling overwhelmed. It was clear, though, that the Queen considered her a suitable match for her youngest son, Prince Leopold. Daisy's feelings were less certain. She respected Leopold, whose delicate health and artistic inclinations made him seem more a friend than a suitor. During a house party at Claremont in early 1880, Leopold revealed his own doubts. Confiding in Daisy, he admitted his heart belonged to another woman. For Daisy, it was a moment of relief and clarity. Her heart was drawn to the steadfast and devoted Lord Brooke, whose quiet strength contrasted with the intrigues of the court. It was during a rainy walk in Surrey that Brooke proposed. Their boots sank into the mud as Brooke, ever earnest, offered his heart. Beneath the shelter of a wide umbrella, Daisy accepted, sealing their engagement. Lord Rosslyn, though disappointed to see royal ambitions dashed, reluctantly gave his blessing. Queen Victoria, however, was furious. Summoned again to Windsor, Daisy faced the monarch's wrath. Victoria demanded an explanation for her rejection of Leopold. Yet, despite her youth, Daisy stood firm. "I have chosen Lord Brooke," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the Queen's disapproval. For the first time, Daisy demonstrated the quiet defiance that would come to define her life. Queen Victoria, unwilling to risk a scandal, begrudgingly accepted her decision. The engagement marked the end of Daisy's adolescence and the beginning of her transformation into one of Edwardian society's most captivating women. It also hinted at the independence and determination that would make her both celebrated and controversial, a woman who, even at 17, refused to let anyone, not even a queen, dictate the course of her life. Daisy and Lord Brooke announced their engagement at a glittering ball in Grosvenor House in June 1880, marking the pinnacle of Daisy's debut season. The young heiress basked in the whirl of high society, later writing, "I was feted, feasted, courted, and adored in one continual round of gaiety." Her beauty and fortune drew throngs of admirers, but none rivaled Brooke's steadfast devotion. Their wedding on April 30th, 1881, in Westminster Abbey, was a spectacle of unmatched brilliance, described by society chroniclers as the most dazzling wedding of a dozen seasons. Prince Leopold stood as best man, while the guest list sparkled with royalty, including the Prince of Wales himself. Queen Victoria, though absent from the ceremony, begrudgingly acknowledged the union. Summoning the newlyweds to Windsor Castle during their honeymoon, she insisted that Daisy appear in her wedding gown, orange blossoms intact. The Queen pronounced the dress enchanting, and in an uncharacteristic gesture, requested a spray of blossoms as a keepsake, a fleeting glimpse of sentimentality in an otherwise chilly relationship. As Lady Brooke, Daisy stepped fully into the glittering world of late Victorian aristocracy. Her first season as a married woman heralded 15 years of unrelenting social activity. Daisy embraced the whirl of grand balls, glittering dinners, and fashionable gatherings with abandon, admitting, "I lived in and for the moment." Among the dashing officers of the Guards and Blues, she was a radiant star. But for her husband, the sight of her captivating so many others was both a source of pride and private anguish. Deeply in love, he trusted her implicitly, even as she grew restless in the gilded cage of their marriage. The couple took possession of Easton Lodge, Daisy's ancestral home, unlocking her considerable inheritance. Though admired for its blend of Elizabethan charm and mock Elizabethan flair, Daisy found the manor insufficient for her rising social ambitions. She embarked on an ambitious renovation, transforming it into what she called a flamboyant pseudo-Gothic palace. The house soon became a beacon of Victorian excess, hosting a steady stream of elite guests. Youth, wealth, and Daisy's seemingly inexhaustible fortune fueled the Brookes' extravagant lifestyle. To be an agreeable young man, well-mannered, with a modest independence and some real skill at sport, was to have the very best of times, Lord Brooke fondly recalled. Their days unfolded like a glittering carousel. Grand balls, glittering dinner parties, Cow's Week, and jaunts to the French Riviera. Amid this endless indulgence, Daisy thrived, her magnetism elevating every occasion. Of all the diversions Victorian life offered, Daisy adored hunting most. The thrill of the chase suited her increasingly daring nature. Clad in elegant side-saddle attire and her signature bowler hat, she cut a striking figure on the hunting field, her audacity earning admiration and occasional disapproval. One audacious incident at Windsor Castle solidified Queen Victoria's growing disdain for Daisy. Invited to stay at the royal residence, Daisy found herself restless and eager to attend the Essex hunt races. After the Queen's stiflingly formal dinner, a small affair attended by Princess Beatrice and a lord-in-waiting, Daisy hatched her plan. Rising before dawn, she donned a vivid pink hunting coat, a bold fashion statement of her own invention, and summoned a carriage to take her to the station. The lord-in-waiting, bound by duty to escort her, was scandalized by her audacity, and the commotion soon reached the Queen. Peering through her window, Victoria caught sight of Daisy boarding the carriage in her flamboyant coat and was aghast, referring to Daisy as fast, the word dripping with moral disapproval. The incident cemented the Queen's opinion of Daisy as a symbol of the self-indulgence and frivolity she so despised in the aristocracy. Beneath her tireless social facade, Daisy's admiration for high society began to show faint cracks. In later years, she would echo Queen Victoria's criticisms, though from a different perspective. The majority of society disliked making the effort necessary to appreciate books, pictures, music, or sculpture, she wrote. What they disliked, they distrusted. Yet for now, Daisy remained blind to the wider injustices of her world. Poverty was personified by her servants, whose crisp aprons and deferential smiles seemed to embody contentment. Lord Brooke would later reflect on their insulated world with poignant candor. Social problems were apparently unknown. I hadn't heard of any, and the right of a young man to make the most agreeable use of his youth went unchallenged. But the Brookes' glittering world, though dazzling, was not impervious to cracks. Beneath the surface of their golden existence, the seeds of scandal and transformation quietly waited, ready to shatter their world and reshape Daisy's destiny. Occasionally, a flicker of unease surfaced. Riding home across open fields, she glimpsed laborers bent beneath their burdens, trudging back to dim cottages. Yet such moments were fleeting. Like her peers, Daisy believed that charity, bazaars, blankets for tenants, forgiven rents, was balm enough for a world divided by station. Class, after all, was divinely ordained. The Victorian hymn, "All Things Bright and Beautiful," echoed through drawing rooms. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly. He ordered their estate. It was a gilded world, blind to its edges, and Daisy moved through it untroubled. Yet beneath her measured acts of virtue, a hunger smoldered, not for piety, but for life, passion. Her encounters with the Prince of Wales, Bertie, were fleeting in those early years, tantalizing in their brevity. At Sandringham, during the clatter of shooting parties, Daisy caught only glimpses of him, laughing, larger than life, surrounded by women far bolder than she. At a ball hosted by the Duke of Edinburgh, Bertie invited her to dance. Daisy, radiant in crimson silk and framed by her striking blue eyes, might have entranced any man alive, yet she later admitted, "I doubtless seemed shy and stupid." The prince's attention drifted elsewhere, drawn to society's parade of beauties. Miss Chamberlain, nicknamed Miss Chamberpots by the sharp-tongued Alexandra, and Mrs. Cornwallis West, a woman renowned for her near-unearthly allure. Bertie's passions, of course, were not confined to ballrooms. Paris knew him well, from the shadowed music halls to the brothels. Even among his libertine circle, his antics drew murmurs. At a late-night can-can led by the Duchess of Manchester, Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria muttered darkly, "The waiters must not see their future king make such a clown of himself." For Daisy, the prince's world was intoxicating, alien, and electric, revealing indulgences that both appalled her propriety and thrilled her spirit. Fate, though, would soon draw her far closer to Bertie's orbit. By the mid-1880s, Daisy was no longer the shy girl in crimson silk. She had learned society's unspoken rules, where marriage was but a facade and extramarital affairs a whispered norm. "From the beginning of our life together," My husband seemed to accept the inevitability of my having a train of admirers, she wrote later. It was all a great game. But games carry stakes, and soon Daisy would play her hand with dangerous consequence. Among the admirers who circled her, none burned brighter than Lord Charles Beresford. A naval officer of roguish charm and relentless vitality, he was Bertie's confidant and Daisy's grand passion. By 1886, their affair was aflame, his visits to Easton Lodge no longer secret to watchful eyes. Passion, however, breeds recklessness. Daisy's jealousy drove her into Lady Charles Beresford's bedroom, where she flung truth like a dagger, declaring their affair and threatening elopement. Lady Charles, unmoved by Daisy's theatrics, whisked her husband away from Easton Lodge, ending the liaison. But humiliation was far from the final act. Consumed by wounded pride, Daisy wrote Lord Charles a letter, a blistering missive accusing him of fathering one of her children and demanding he abandon his wife. Utterly shocking, it was said, and Lady Charles seized upon it. The letter landed in the hands of George Lewis, a solicitor who made his living untangling the sordid knots of society's scandals. Desperate to reclaim her damning words, Daisy turned to the Prince of Wales. Bertie intervened first as protector, then as something more. Daisy later recalled, "I saw him looking at me in a way all women understand." He pressed Lady Charles to destroy the letter, but she refused, demanding Daisy's banishment from London's royal season. Bertie escalated. Invitations to the Beresfords ceased. Whispers of disgrace followed them through drawing rooms. Furious, Lady Charles accused the prince of blackmail, but his influence prevailed. The scandal ignited a rift between Bertie and Lord Charles that smoldered until January 1890, when the two men came face to face. Lord Charles, his anger unquenched, called the future king a blackguard. The argument nearly ended in blows, broken only by Lord Charles's departure to command HMS Undaunted. For Daisy, the scandal was both punishment and reward. Bertie's protection ensured her place at his side, her reliance on him deepening, their connection undeniable. The affair had ended in jealousy, humiliation, and near ruin. But it had also shattered something within her. A woman who, once so shy on the dance floor, had now emerged as a figure impossible to ignore. She had crossed the threshold from beauty to infamy, and there was no turning back. 9 years after his celebrated affair with Lily Langtry ended, the Prince of Wales fell deeply, hopelessly in love once again. This time, it was not merely a passing infatuation. To him, Daisy Brooke, vivacious, beautiful, and sharp-witted, was not just a mistress, but something far more intimate. In his eyes, she was his wife. He addressed her so, his darling Daisy wife, his own adored little Daisy wife. Unlike the ephemeral attachments of his past, Daisy intrigued the prince beyond surface charm. She was more than a social butterfly drawn to scandal. She was intelligent, worldly, and capable of discussing what she called the affairs of the greater world outside. The prince, though not a man known for astuteness, quickly recognized Daisy's substance. In these early years, he could scarcely bear to be apart from her, filling the distance with letters, often thrice weekly, bursting with affectionate trivialities. "Now, my loved one," he would write from Chatsworth, "I must dress and breakfast. God bless you, my own adored little Daisy wife. Forever yours, your only love." To Daisy, this man, the prince, the future king, was sentimental to the core. He remembered every anniversary, every significant moment, and delighted in bestowing tokens of his affection. A traveling clock with a sentimental little gadget, a plain gold ring inscribed as though it were an unspoken vow, gifts showered upon her at the slightest hint of admiration. "I grew to like him very much," Daisy later reflected. "I think anybody would have been won by him." And Daisy was won, not just by the man, but by the life he offered. As his obsession grew, so too did her place within the glittering world of the Marlborough House set. She described it in later years as though recalling the magic of a pantomime's transformation scene. Society's shimmering gowns and dazzling figures, the thrill of stepping into an enchanted fairyland. She sailed at Cowes, raced at Goodwood and Epsom, and attended every ball, house party, and opera where the prince's shadow loomed large. Soon, the gossip pages of society journals immortalized her as the woman who held the Prince of Wales's heart. At the opera, the world reported breathlessly, Lady Brooke was glimpsed, a brilliant, haughty beauty whose fame had pierced even to the quietest corners of the countryside. Paris, however, was where their romance truly flourished. Traveling under the transparent alias of Baron Renfrew, the prince stayed at the Hotel Bristol while Daisy discreetly lodged nearby. Together, they climbed the Eiffel Tower, admired art, and indulged in the pleasures of Parisian cuisine. Daisy claimed she dared not admire anything in the shop windows for fear gifts would rain upon her. Of course, Paris also meant fashion, and with the prince as her benefactor, Daisy Brooke became the living embodiment of elegance. She visited the leading couturiers, Doucet for day dresses, Worth for gowns of staggering extravagance. At Worth's atelier, the process was almost sacred. This, Worth would murmur, selecting luxurious fabric as though painting a masterpiece. This and this. Under his hands, the gowns took shape, each a symbol of Daisy's rise to society's pinnacle. No ball, no soiree, no hunt passed without her dazzling the room. Her gowns, chronicled breathlessly by society columns, were masterpieces in violet velvet, pearls, and diaphanous layers, always with the Prince of Wales at her side. In London, they shared stolen moments at private supper rooms in the Café Royal and Kettner's, places discreet enough to allow intimacy, yet luxurious enough to satisfy royalty. Behind those closed doors, Daisy confessed, the Prince of Wales was a very perfect, gentle lover. The romance, intense as it was, benefited from the quiet evolution of Victorian sensibilities. The advent of rubber condoms, spurred by vulcanization, offered discreet protection for lovers like them. At last, passion no longer came with the threat of scandalous consequence. The manufacturers, ever irreverent, emblazoned Queen Victoria and Mr. Gladstone on their packaging, an irony surely not lost on the prince. But for Daisy, the prince's love was more than jewels and ballrooms. It was a force that propelled her into a world of influence and intrigue, a world where she was both muse and confidant. And in the public eye, no matter the whispers, she stood as a woman of beauty, wit, and undeniable power. Daisy Brooke's country home, Easton Lodge, was the resplendent stage upon which her affair with the Prince of Wales played out. Set in 1,200 acres of sweeping Essex parkland, where ancient oaks stood sentinel over grazing herds of deer, Easton was an embodiment of Victorian grandeur. Though Daisy's ambitions to transform it into a mock Gothic palace never came to fruition, the mansion exuded an eclectic magnificence, a vivid blend of tasteful opulence and ostentatious clutter. Rooms draped in brightly flowered wallpaper showcased old masters beside faded family portraits, priceless objets d'art jostled with trifling knickknacks. In the hall, surrounded by hunting trophies from Lord Brooke's exploits, loomed the improbable neck and head of a giraffe, stuffed and towering over all. It was here that Daisy presided with the confident charm of a grand dame. The loveliest woman in England, one guest enthused, of high rank, ample riches, and great intelligence, blessed with a charming husband who adored her. Whether Lord Brooke's adoration remained as steadfast as appearances suggested is uncertain. If love meant standing aside to allow one's wife unrestrained happiness, however, then Lord Brooke was indeed an ideal husband. He accepted Daisy's liaison with the Prince of Wales with a stoic grace. The prince, Daisy explained, admired Lord Brooke's repose of temperament and shared with him a camaraderie rooted in sport. Lord Brooke himself spoke of the royal guest in only the most benign terms, describing him as affable, courteous, and responsive, a man who made prince or plowman feel at ease. No trace of jealousy or resentment marred his public composure, nor, for that matter, did his own indiscretions. Daisy's husband was not above flirtation. When a lady guest was caught in his arms mid-rose garden, she fled indoors in indignation, only for her husband to laugh and declare, "Good old Brookie." For Daisy, the prince's visits to Easton were idyllic interludes. Here, stripped of the formal trappings of court life, he indulged in his love of nature, strolling hand in hand with Daisy across the park to the little church on Sunday mornings, or through her celebrated garden of friendship. Unlike some of his former mistresses, Daisy proved an engaging companion beyond the ballrooms and boudoirs. She delighted in political gossip, foreign affairs, and matters of social reform, revealing herself to be a woman of both intellect and substance. At Easton, the royal visits required military-scale preparations. House parties, or what Daisy termed brilliant gatherings, were orchestrated with meticulous care. Guests arrived by special train, their luggage, brass-bound, domed trunks padlocked shut, conveyed in a fleet of carriages. Servants swarmed to meet the influx, bands played, and feasts were prepared with indulgent extravagance: caviar, ptarmigans, ortolans, champagne. One chef's culinary brilliance, Daisy sighed, was rivaled only by his wastefulness. Among those swept into Daisy's glittering orbit was Eleanor Glynn, the future romantic novelist, who moved near Easton in 1892. Glynn, a striking redhead with jade-green eyes, described Daisy with a fascination bordering on reverence. "I have never seen anyone so completely fascinating," she declared, as Daisy Brooke. She possessed beauty and wit, but also that supreme personal charm I later called it. Daisy's allure, Glynn reflected, lay in her innocence as much as her mischief. She would arrive at parties, a piping bullfinch perched on her hand, her smile the playful expression of a Persian kitten tangled in silk. At Easton, Daisy was more than a hostess. She was a diplomat in the intricate game of society liaisons. She had a sixth sense for romantic intrigue. Should two guests arrange a clandestine meeting, she would subtly smooth the way. "Stone Hall, my little pleasure house," she might suggest innocently, providing privacy without scandal. And should strangers blunder into the scene, Daisy would graciously detain them with polite conversation until her friends had made their escape. In such moments, Daisy's mastery of discretion elevated her role beyond that of a mistress or hostess. She was a power player in her own right, a woman whose influence rippled through the gilded circles of society. This world of opulent entertainment came at a staggering cost. For the Rothschilds or Devonshires, the expense was manageable. For others, it was ruinous. Men and women scrimped and sank into debt for the privilege of entertaining royalty. Christopher Sykes, the prince's sycophantic companion, knew this all too well. Sykes had bankrupted himself, hosting parties at Brantingham Thorpe, reduced to financial ruin by his devotion to the prince's pleasure. And yet, in this dazzling world of privilege, whispered secrets, and borrowed fortunes, time exacted its revenge. By 1890, the prince's visit to Doncaster for the St. Leger races, a yearly tradition, saw him staying not with Sykes, but with Arthur Wilson, a wealthy shipowner at Tranby Croft. It was there that scandal erupted, the fallout from a gambling incident shaking the prince's life and leaving shadows that no amount of champagne or silk-draped rooms could dispel. The Tranby Croft scandal, one of the most infamous episodes of the Victorian age, cast a long and lasting shadow over Daisy Brooke, marking her with the cruel epithet, the babbling Brooke. It all began with the Wilson family, wealthy shipowners who were ecstatic to host the Prince of Wales at their home near Doncaster for the St. Leger races. Naturally, Daisy and Lord Brooke were invited, but the death of Daisy's stepfather, Lord Rosslyn, prevented their attendance. In their absence, the prince arrived with his entourage, which included Sir William Gordon Cumming, a dashing Scots Guards officer, and the smartest man about town, as Daisy once described him. Gordon Cumming, however, would prove to be not quite smart enough. Over 2 nights of baccarat, whispers erupted that he had been caught cheating. Confronted by the prince and the other guests, Sir William signed a private document promising never to play cards again, a pledge extracted under the condition that the affair remains strictly secret. It was a fragile truce, and secrets, as Daisy well knew, rarely stayed hidden long. Days later, on her journey north to Scotland for her stepfather's funeral, Daisy and the prince crossed paths at York Station. Perhaps eager to unburden himself, Bertie confided the entire sordid affair to Daisy. The details, it seems, did not stop there. Whether Daisy shared the tale with her relations at the funeral, as gossip claimed, or whether it escaped through other lips, the damage was done. The scandal broke, and at the center of the rumor mill stood Daisy Brooke, forever branded as the indiscreet culprit. The babbling Brooke, society sneered. The title, with its cruel cleverness, clung to her for the rest of her days, an injustice Daisy always vehemently denied. Her version of events, both during and after the trial, painted her as a bystander caught in the storm, an unwilling scapegoat for a scandal that seemed destined to explode. Once exposed, Sir William Gordon Cumming was forced to sue for libel to salvage his name, dragging the entire sordid affair into court. The Prince of Wales, much to Queen Victoria's horror, found himself embroiled in the proceedings, sitting in the witness box under the gaze of a disapproving nation. But though Gordon Cumming lost his case, public opinion turned against the prince, and by extension, against Daisy herself. The newspapers seized the moment, steeping themselves in moral outrage. The Times condemned the prince's involvement, and the Review of Reviews bristled with scorn, denouncing his circle as a collection of gamblers, wastrels, and worse. The whispers around Daisy were no kinder. Women in society, who had once smiled knowingly at her wit and elegance, now watched her with suspicion. Years later, Daisy reflected on the ordeal with surprising generosity toward Sir William. "I considered him more sinned against than sinning," she claimed. "His punishment had been merciless. Dismissed from the army, expelled from his clubs, and ostracized from society, he spent the rest of his life in bitter seclusion." Daisy admitted to sad thoughts of him, confessing that despite it all, she had kept a warm corner in my heart for him. For Daisy, the scandal did more than bruise her reputation. It solidified her role in the public imagination as a woman at the center of intrigue, charm, and controversy. She was no stranger to society's double standards, where men's indiscretions were forgiven and forgotten, while women's whispers became their defining sins. And yet, Daisy remained undaunted. Her wit was intact, her allure undiminished. If society labeled her a gossip, then so be it. She would play her part with grace. In the years that followed, as Bertie withdrew to Sandringham to lick his wounds, Daisy's presence remained a testament to her resilience. For while the Tranby Croft trial had rattled a future king, it would not shake Daisy Brooke from the place she had carved for herself in the glittering world she ruled so effortlessly. No sooner had the storm of the Tranby Croft scandal quieted than another tempest erupted around Daisy Brooke. This time, her rival, Lady Charles Beresford, reignited a feud that threatened to shatter Daisy's carefully constructed world. Lady Charles, embittered by her exclusion from the Prince of Wales's inner circle, could no longer tolerate Daisy's ascendance. The final straw came in the summer of 1891, when the prince publicly received Daisy at Marlborough House, a mark of favor Lady Charles found unbearable. Furious, she demanded that her husband, Lord Charles Beresford, take action. Lord Charles, fiery and impetuous, responded with a letter so dangerous it shook the highest ranks of society. In it, he accused the Prince of Wales of behaving like a blackguard and a coward, and threatened to expose the affair to the public. The letter reached not the prince, but the Prime Minister, along with a chilling warning. Lady Charles's sister had already written a pamphlet, thinly veiled as Lady River, detailing Daisy's affair with the prince. Rumors spread that the pamphlet could be used as a political weapon in the next election. The stakes were too high to ignore. Behind the scenes, desperate negotiations ensued to contain the scandal. The Prime Minister appealed to Lord Charles's sense of honor, reminding him of the laws of our class. A gentleman must never disgrace his former mistress. But the damage was already spreading. Copies of Lady River circulated like wildfire through London's drawing rooms. Society hostesses held readings, gleefully dissecting Daisy's reputation. The Princess of Wales, Alexandra, usually tolerant of Bertie's indiscretions, refused to return from Denmark for his 50th birthday, her absence a public rebuke. Meanwhile, whispers of divorce swirled around Lord Brooke, who had long tolerated Daisy's indiscretions, but now appeared to have reached his limit. Yet divorce was unthinkable. To drag their private lives into the public courts, naming the Prince of Wales among others, would have been ruinous for everyone involved. Lord Brooke chose silence, an act of quiet gallantry that spared Daisy and their family further shame. For Daisy, the scandal was a personal humiliation, but it did not diminish her hold on the Prince of Wales. If anything, his devotion only deepened. 5 years later, at Ascot, the prince encountered Lord Charles Beresford for the first time in years. That same day, Bertie wrote to Daisy in a letter overflowing with loyalty and affection. "My own lovely little Daisy, I lose no time in writing to tell you of an episode which occurred today after you left. I saw Lord Charles at the racetrack. He came up with his hat off and would not put it on till I told him, and shook hands. We talked a little about racing, then I turned and we parted. What struck me more than anything was his humble attitude and manner. My loyalty to you is, I hope, a thing that you will never think of doubting. Despite the pamphlets, the whispers, and the near ruin of reputations, Daisy Brooke remained the woman who held the prince's heart. To society, she might have been the babbling brook, a figure of scandal and intrigue. But to the prince, she was still his darling Daisy wife. Though one wonders what the prince would have thought if he knew that after his death, those very same letters which he wrote her would be used by Daisy to blackmail the monarchy. In December 1893, Daisy Brooke's life changed once again. With her husband inheriting the title of Earl of Warwick, she became the Countess of Warwick. The stage for this next act was Warwick Castle, an ancient fortress of stone and shadow, perched above the River Avon. Under Daisy's reign, the castle, long dormant and gray, exploded with life. Her most dazzling performance came in February 1895, when Daisy transformed Warwick into a Versailles fantasy. Her ball, dedicated to Louis XVI, was unlike anything the castle had seen in centuries. Guests arrived in powdered wigs and silken gowns, their hair towering in ornate cascades, while candlelight flickered off diamonds and gilded brocade. Daisy herself, dressed as Marie Antoinette in turquoise velvet and a plume of ostrich feathers, presided like a queen of her own creation. But no sooner had the last guest departed than reality struck with a cruel hand. A left-wing newspaper, The Clarion, attacked her extravagance, accusing her of wasting thousands on a silly masquerade while so many lived in poverty. Furious and indignant, Daisy saw the ball as a source of employment, a boon for dressmakers, gardeners, and maids. But her anger wouldn't let her sit idle. Without hesitation, she caught the next train to London, arriving unannounced at the Clarion's office. Robert Blatchford, the paper's editor, looked up to see the Countess of Warwick, draped in elegance, standing in his doorway. "How could you write such lies?" Daisy demanded, the newspaper clenched in her hand. "That ball gave work to half the county." Blatchford, unmoved by her indignation, invited her to sit. And then, calmly, he began to speak, not with anger, but with conviction. What good, he asked, were a few days of labor that led nowhere? What of the workers who toiled endlessly for the whims of the wealthy, only to remain trapped in poverty? For hours, Daisy listened as Blatchford laid bare the injustice of the world, how the labor that truly mattered was often dismissed, ignored. On the train home to Warwickshire, his words echoed in her mind, piercing her pride. She later wrote, "I knew that my outlook on life could never be the same as before that day. It was as if I had found a real world." Daisy's awakening was not immediate. The lavish parties continued, as did her affair with the Prince of Wales. But a seed had been planted, a small, unshakable conviction that her privilege could be put to better use. "I wondered," she mused later, "might I not take my royal lover by the hand and lead him along that same enlightened path?" This awakening was gradual but profound. Daisy began to see her privilege not merely as a birthright, but as a responsibility. She ran for election as a trustee of the local workhouse, delivering a speech that called for shared responsibility between men and women, an unusually progressive stance for her time. Her victory marked her first step into public life, blending her aristocratic status with her growing desire for reform. She began to write articles favoring women's right to vote and for fairer treatment of the working classes. Her evolving purpose, however, did not diminish her flair for theatrics. In 1896, the fallout from the Jameson Raid, a botched British invasion of the Boer-controlled Transvaal, offered Daisy a new outlet for her dramatic instincts. To many, the raid was reckless imperialism, but Daisy, drawn to romantic notions of empire, saw it as a valiant stand. Outraged by Germany's support for the Boers, she penned a fiery letter to the Times, defending the raiders and rebuking the press for its disloyalty. Writing on behalf of all Englishwomen, she even delivered a veiled swipe at Kaiser Wilhelm II. The letter caused a sensation, but rumors soon spread that Daisy had written directly to the Kaiser. Her uncle, Count Münster, the German ambassador, expressed his disapproval. "I hear Daisy has written a most impertinent letter to the Emperor. She ought to have dressed in black and held her tongue." Daisy might have laughed off the absurdity, but the Prince of Wales was livid. At Bertie's insistence, Daisy sent a formal denial, drafted under his watchful eye. Her response was cutting. I cannot get over my astonishment at so unwarrantable a statement. This is not the first time you have said unkind things about me to Mama. I feel your unkindness very deeply." Though Count Munster apologized, he couldn't resist a final barb. Ladies ought not to be jingos. But Daisy remained unapologetic. Her patriotism, especially where Cecil Rhodes was concerned, burned brightly. Through her mentor, W.T. Steed, Daisy had come to admire Rhodes as a visionary. Steed, a radical journalist known for his groundbreaking exposés and reformist zeal, had become one of Daisy's closest confidants. He believed in the moral mission of empire, a conviction that resonated with Daisy. Together, they had successfully got the government to raise the age of consent from 13 to 16. Through his eyes, Rhodes was not a disgraced opportunist, but a man whose ambition could elevate the British Empire. Even Bertie, undeterred by Rhodes's public controversies, called him a remarkable man and welcomed him into royal circles. Rhodes, for his part, was an unconventional figure. Disheveled and brusque, he lacked the polish of Daisy's aristocratic world, yet his ideas captivated her. Cecil Rhodes was that strange, unmistakable thing, a man of genius, she later wrote. Despite his reputation as a misogynist, Daisy believed she had earned his genuine affection. By late 1896, Daisy saw herself as a bridge between Steed's radical ideals and Bertie's royal influence. She hosted a luncheon at her South Audley Street home, bringing the two men together in hopes of aligning their power for progressive causes. Steed, typically unshakable, found himself nervous in Bertie's presence, fretting over topics of conversation. But when the prince arrived, his genial charm put Steed at ease. The discussion meandered from politics to pensions, and while Daisy imagined herself forging a lasting connection between these two contrasting figures, the reality was less impactful. Steed's fiery zeal and Bertie's casual interest were worlds apart. As Daisy's relationships with both men evolved, so too did her focus. By 1897, the golden era of Daisy's relationship with Bertie was fading. Their once vibrant affair had turned platonic, as was inevitable with the prince's restless nature. For Daisy, who had never been deeply in love with him, the shift felt more like a release than a heartbreak. "I found him boresome," she later admitted to a friend, recalling evenings when he sat goggling at me while holding her hand. Bertie's attentions drifted elsewhere, to Alice Keppel, who would soon replace Daisy as his favored mistress. Meanwhile, Daisy's own focus shifted decisively, inspired by her growing commitment to social reform and the influence she threw herself into progressive causes. Bertie, ever obliging, even accompanied her to meet laborers, though the visit ended awkwardly when one berated him for the inequities of the class system. It was Daisy's personal life, however, that marked the final chapter of her connection with Bertie. In March 1898, at the age of 35, she gave birth to her fourth child, a son, Maynard, a child who brought her profound joy and affection, a stark contrast to her more distant relationships with her older children. Tragically, her third child, believed to have been fathered by Lord Charles, had died at just 18 months old. Speculation swirled about Maynard's paternity as well. Many biographers claimed the boy was Bertie's, and despite the end of their affair, the prince continued to support Daisy for the rest of his life. Others suggested the child's father was Joseph Laycock. Whatever the truth, the birth symbolized both a closing and an opening chapter in Daisy's life. Aware of the shifting tides of royal favor and the scrutiny of Queen Victoria, Daisy staged her exit with characteristic finesse. She wrote 2 carefully crafted letters, one to Bertie and one to Alexandra. In her letter to the prince, she emphasized the platonic nature of their relationship and expressed her hope to remain his loyal friend. To Alexandra, she appealed as a noble and gracious woman, seeking forgiveness and urging her to rise above the gossip that surrounded them. Her strategy was masterful. Bertie, moved by Daisy's beautiful letter, shared it with Alexandra, who responded with measured grace. Outwardly forgiving, Alexandra maintained her frosty distance. Her son, the Duke of York, made the family's position clear in a terse letter to his wife. "In case you should hear from Lady Warwick asking you to become president of a charity of hers, refuse it. Mother dear has done so and wishes you to do the same." Daisy cherished Alexandra's final gesture, a small crucifix wrapped in paper, inscribed with the words, "From one who has suffered much and forgives all." Whether a sincere offering or a quiet rebuke, it marked the symbolic conclusion of Daisy's royal chapter. For Daisy Warwick, the affair with Bertie was never truly about love. It was about power, influence, and a place at the epicenter of Edwardian society. As the prince turned his attentions elsewhere, Daisy emerged unscathed and undiminished. Her ambitions, once tied to royal favor, had evolved. Now, with her focus on reform, sharpening, and her passions redirected, she stepped confidently into a new role. Not as a royal mistress, but as a woman determined to leave a very different kind of legacy. By 1898, Daisy Warwick's relentless quest for love reached a fever pitch. At 36, she was swept into an intoxicating affair with the dashing Captain Joseph Laycock. 5 years her junior, Laycock was a man of rugged charm and magnetic energy, exuding the kind of raw allure that made women lose their footing. Powerfully built and wealthy, he embodied the aristocratic traditions Daisy so often decried in public, yet she adored him with a fervor that bordered on obsession. She later admitted she worshipped him wildly. This was no repeat of her dalliance with the Prince of Wales. With Bertie, Daisy had held the reins, basking in his devotion. With Laycock, the roles reversed. Daisy was no longer the conqueror but the conquered, her love unreciprocated in equal measure. Laycock, captivated at first, gifted her the customary wedding ring of a clandestine affair, a gesture she must have poignantly accepted after removing Bertie's ring. For a time, Laycock appeared to share her passion, even supporting Daisy's humanitarian endeavors with financial contributions at a moment when she desperately needed them. Her opulent lifestyle had begun to devour her wealth. The fortune that once amounted to £30,000 a year had dwindled to a paltry £6,000, a reality Daisy refused to confront. She continued to dazzle society in exquisite gowns, spending extravagantly on her estates, while insisting she cared little for money. But their romance burned fast and bright, extinguished by Laycock's departure to fight in the Boer War. Daisy, left behind, was gripped by jealousy and paranoia, her imagination haunted by visions of Laycock's infidelities. Her worst fears materialized upon his return. An innocuous hunting accident introduced him to the radiant Kitty Downshire, 11 years Daisy's junior, married and captivating. Their connection was instant, and Daisy, eclipsed, spiraled into despair. Her letters to Laycock became frantic, desperate missives, drenched in longing. "Joe, my Joe," she scrawled in one trembling note, "if you could see how my hand shakes when I write your name." But her appeals fell on indifferent ears. The scandal erupted when news broke that Kitty's husband intended to divorce her, naming Laycock as co-respondent. Daisy, convinced her lover would marry Kitty, wielded every weapon in her arsenal to prevent the union. She even sought the intervention of her former paramour, King Edward. "The king was more than nice to me," Daisy confided to Laycock in 1902, grasping at hope. "He agrees about it all and says, as we do, you must go away for a bit, then things will be all right." But even royal council couldn't dissuade Laycock. In November of that year, he married Kitty Downshire. Daisy, heartbroken and humiliated, penned him a scathing rebuke, lamenting that while friends from across the globe had remembered her birthday, even the king gifting her a diamond and turquoise bracelet, she had received nothing from Joe, the man she had given everything. The betrayal didn't end their entanglement. A few years later, Daisy bore Laycock's child, further complicating her already tumultuous life. By this point, her personal finances were crumbling under the weight of her extravagance. Her estate at Easton boasted a sprawling menagerie, complete with rare birds, ponies, and even a white peacock that roamed its opulent grounds. Her gardens, designed by a renowned architect, stretched over 10 meticulously landscaped acres, including a canal lined with lilies. It was a display of excess, at odds with the socialist ideals she professed. But Daisy's contradictions didn't end there. She turned her attention to grander pursuits. Warwick Castle became her stage for fostering an Anglo-American alliance. Dignitaries and American tourists alike were greeted with the stars and stripes flying from the castle's ramparts as Daisy envisioned uniting the English-speaking world. Her audacity knew no bounds. She even encouraged Steed to find a wealthy American philanthropist to bankroll her utopian vision. King Edward, however, refused to support her efforts, tactfully pointing out that Britain's future alliances lay in Europe, not across the Atlantic. Even Daisy's elaborate tea parties, orchestrated to charm the American wives of British aristocrats, couldn't sway him. Yet Bertie remained steadfast in his personal support. When Daisy's eldest son, Guy, insisted on fighting in the Boer War at just 17, Bertie offered guidance to keep him out of harm's way. He even counseled Daisy on persuading her husband, the Earl of Warwick, to forgo military service. Through it all, Daisy and Bertie's friendship endured, a bond steeped in mutual affection. In 1899, on the 10th anniversary of their affair, Bertie wrote her a heartfelt letter affirming the reality and sincerity of their connection. His letters, Daisy reflected, were unselfish, always full of praise for others and wise counsel, but Daisy's penchant for drama and financial recklessness would eventually poison even this relationship. Decades later, as her fortunes dwindled further, she threatened to use Bertie's affectionate letters to blackmail his son, King George V. The death of Queen Victoria in 1901 and the coronation of Edward VII, her former lover, seemed to offer Daisy a flicker of renewed promise. No longer a mere relic of Bertie's past, she imagined herself ascending to a new role, trusted confidant, even a discreet advisor to the newly crowned king. Yet these aspirations were swiftly and unceremoniously shattered. Shortly after Edward's ascension, Viscount Esher, one of the king's most trusted advisors, arrived at Daisy's door bearing a message cloaked in elegant brutality. Queen Alexandra, now wielding her position with quiet but implacable resolve, demanded Daisy's withdrawal from royal affairs. "It is not personal," Esher assured her. But Daisy, ever adept at reading between the lines, knew better. Alexandra, whose glacial composure had endured a lifetime of her husband's indiscretions, would not tolerate a countess with radical views and a scandal-strewn past, tarnishing the carefully crafted image of the new monarchy. Soon after, Alexandra's final blow arrived in the form of a letter. Restrained and distant, its tone as cold as the queen herself, it formally severed Daisy from the royal circle. Edward VII, though privately kind and exchanging occasional letters and tokens of affection, would never again openly align himself with Daisy. "The court," Daisy remarked with bitter elegance, "has no memory for those it discards." Yet, just as Daisy resolved to reinvent herself as a champion for the voiceless, life dealt her another unexpected hand. In 1904, at the age of 42, she discovered she was pregnant once more. "Oh, mercy!" she reportedly exclaimed upon realizing her condition, and Mercy became the name of her youngest daughter. The arrival of Mercy, fathered by Laycock, came at a time when Daisy's life was already at a crossroads. Torn between her aristocratic roots and her burgeoning passion for social reform, she found little room for traditional motherhood. While other mothers balanced their households, Daisy balanced campaign speeches and cooperative meetings, leaving her youngest child in the care of nannies. The irony was not lost on her. "I fight for mothers with a dozen children and no bread," she later reflected, "yet I have but one and no time." Despite this conflict, Daisy poured her heart into her activism, transforming Easton Lodge into a crucible of radical thought. Gone were the idle gossip and glittering frivolities of her youth. In their place came impassioned debates and revolutionary ideals, as her dining tables welcomed intellectual luminaries like H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, and Ramsay MacDonald. "I learned to listen," Daisy reflected in later years. "For the first time, I truly began to see." Yet for all her proletarian sympathies, Daisy remained unmistakably grand. Draped in furs, she addressed cooperative society meetings, in pearls, entertained trade unionists in her Italianate London home, and traveled to workers' rallies in her 40-horsepower Wolseley, her voice ringing out over crowded halls, urging reforms like free meals for schoolchildren. At Naughton Towers, the luxurious home of her son-in-law, Viscount Helmsley, she campaigned for Labour candidates in the heart of conservative strongholds. "She speaks of equality but lives like a queen," her son Guy once remarked, bewildered by the dualities of her life. Daisy did not deny the contradictions. "I do not care for pearls," she quipped to an aristocratic critic, "but if they draw the eye long enough for someone to hear the truth, then I shall wear them." Her passion for reform was neither performative nor fleeting. By 1905, Daisy had done the unthinkable for a woman of her rank. She joined the Social Democratic Federation, Britain's most radical socialist organization. The The press, salivating at the incongruity of a pearl-clad countess marching alongside factory workers, dubbed her the Red Countess. Critics accused her of betraying her class, while reformers hailed her as a powerful, if improbable, ally. Her speeches were as daring as they were eloquent, laced with humor and conviction. To a crowd of factory workers, she confessed, "You may think it strange to see a countess among you, but let me tell you, there's no manual more exhausting than writing checks for the undeserving rich." At another rally, she declared, "The gilded rooms of my birth taught me one thing, that wealth without justice is a prison, and I refuse to remain its prisoner." Yet this new chapter came with immense personal cost. Her aristocratic friends, scandalized by her socialism, abandoned her. Her sister Millicent, the mother of Rosemary, stopped speaking with her, believing her performances false, and her eldest son Guy, who had never been close to his mother, stopped speaking with her and turned to drink. Her finances, already precarious from years of extravagant entertaining, crumbled under the weight of her new commitments. By 1907, Daisy was drowning in debt, forced to sell heirlooms and properties to sustain her causes. But she never wavered. "If the cost of purpose is poverty," she wrote, "then I shall pay it gladly." Through it all, Daisy stood at the crossroads of two worlds, the crumbling aristocracy of her birth and the rising tide of socialism she had embraced. At a rally in Manchester in 1908, her voice rose with undiminished fervor. "The world I was born into is dying, and I do not mourn its loss. From its ashes, let a better world rise, a world for the worker, the mother, the child, and we must build it together." By 1914, Daisy's debts were staggering. Warwick Castle and Easton Lodge were mortgaged beyond redemption, her valuables sold or seized, and her grand schemes to revive her fortunes. Writing newspaper columns, lecturing in America, or penning scripts for the cinema had all come to nothing. With creditors circling and no relief in sight, Daisy turned her gaze to the one asset she had left, the love letters of her former royal lover, Edward VII. These were no ordinary letters. Addressed to his darling Daisy wife, they were rich with endearments, but also indiscreet political musings, a dangerous combination from a man who had reigned as monarch. While most of Edward's private correspondence had been destroyed upon his death, Daisy had held on to her letters, treasures of sentiment that now promised salvation. But Daisy had no intention of exposing the king's secrets to the world. Instead, she sought payment not for publication, but for her silence. And the price of that silence? £100,000, an astronomical sum, even by Edwardian standards. To carry out her scheme, Daisy enlisted intermediaries, including the notorious Frank Harris, a literary rogue with a nose for scandal, and Arthur Dew Cross, a respectable businessman and her creditor. Daisy's plan was to let the palace know, through carefully placed hints, that the letters might find their way into Harris's hands, or worse, to America, unless her financial woes were resolved. The message was received loud and clear. Soon, representatives of King George V, Edward's son, began to maneuver behind the scenes to suppress the potential scandal. But the palace was far craftier than Daisy anticipated. Instead of paying her off, they deployed every tool of discretion and influence to neutralize the threat. Detectives were sent to track the letters, legal injunctions were issued in secrecy, and Daisy found herself outmaneuvered at every turn. By the summer of 1914, her plot collapsed. The letters, once her greatest weapon, were surrendered under the watchful eyes of royal solicitors and destroyed, their contents lost forever. Daisy, however, was never one to concede defeat entirely. Though she lost the battle over the letters, she emerged with a consolation prize. Arthur Dew Cross, perhaps eager to end the ordeal or to shield his own reputation, forgave her significant debts and took on her mounting bills, totaling over £60,000. "I am handing back with splendid generosity," Daisy later declared, cloaking her failed gambit in an air of moral victory. "The letters King Edward wrote me of his great love." Despite her losses, Daisy carried on, as irrepressible as ever. Years later, when she published her memoirs, she made no mention of the letters or the scandal they nearly unleashed. Instead, she portrayed herself as a loyal confidant, too noble to betray the intimacies of the powerful. "How could I betray the great ones who trusted me?" she asked rhetorically. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Daisy found herself standing at odds with much of her social class. While the British aristocracy rallied behind the war effort with patriotic fervor, Daisy's voice rang out as a discordant note. She viewed the conflict not as a noble crusade, but as a calamity born of imperial greed and the ambitions of the elite. To Daisy, the trenches of Europe were not theaters of valor, but slaughterhouses for the working class, a brutal testament to the inequities she had spent years fighting to expose. Daisy's opposition to the war was unflinching. She joined pacifist organizations, attended anti-war meetings, and lent her name to causes supporting conscientious objectors. Her speeches during this time were fiery and unapologetic, cutting to the heart of the war's class dynamics. At one rally, she proclaimed, "The blood of the poor is the price of the rich man's power. How much longer will you pay it?" These sentiments alienated many, even within her own family, some of whom were serving at the front, and it is possible that this action changed the course of the monarchy forever, as during these years the young Prince Edward was courting Daisy's niece, Lady Rosemary, and sought to marry her. But his mother, Queen Mary, refused the union over what she called Rosemary's tainted blood. For more information on Lady Rosemary and her relationship with the prince, please check out our video on the channel. To her aristocratic peers, Daisy's pacifism was tantamount to treason, a betrayal of her class and country. The press, eager for scandal, painted her as a hypocrite, a countess draped in pearls, daring to lecture on the exploitation of the working class. Yet Daisy stood firm, her belief in the futility of the war unshaken. In a letter from 1916, she wrote, "What victory can there be when mothers bury their sons for the sake of borders drawn by kings?" Despite her pacifist stance, Daisy was not idle during the war. True to her ideals, she found ways to contribute that aligned with her beliefs. She transformed Easton Lodge into a convalescent hospital for wounded soldiers, providing a serene environment for healing. Soldiers recovering at her estate often remarked on her kindness, though some found her political views perplexing. Daisy used these interactions as opportunities to discuss the inequalities that had sent so many young men to their deaths. She also lobbied for better treatment of returning soldiers, particularly working-class veterans, whom she feared would face neglect once the war ended. Her vision extended beyond the battlefield. She argued that Britain's post-war recovery must address the systemic inequalities that had fueled the conflict, warning, "If we rebuild the same house of greed and privilege, we will only prepare for the next war." By the war's end in 1918, Daisy's efforts were both lauded and derided. To some, she was a courageous voice for peace and reform, a woman unafraid to challenge the status quo. To others, she was a deluded idealist, clinging to the remnants of her aristocratic life while championing causes she could never truly embody. Even within socialist circles, her wealth and title made her an object of suspicion. One critic famously quipped, "She preaches equality from a velvet chaise, sipping tea from porcelain finer than most will ever see." But Daisy was undeterred. She continued writing articles, delivering speeches, and advocating for land reform and social justice. She envisioned a Britain where the sacrifices of war would lead to a more equitable society, a dream she tirelessly pursued despite mounting criticism. The promises of a fairer society, so often invoked during wartime, quickly evaporated in the post-war years. Returning soldiers faced unemployment and poverty, and the aristocracy largely resumed its gilded existence. For Daisy, this disillusionment only reignited her fervor for reform. She declared in a speech in 1919, "The trenches may be empty, but the battle for justice has only begun." This time, the enemy is not across the channel, but in the halls of power. Her financial struggles, exacerbated by her philanthropic commitments during the war, became fodder for tabloids eager to tarnish her reputation. Yet Daisy refused to retreat. In her later writings, she reflected on the war as a personal crucible, a time that tested her beliefs and her resilience. "I was born to privilege, but it is the suffering of others that has taught me to live. If that lesson makes me an outcast, then so be it." No one could accuse Daisy of fading quietly into her twilight years. As the world changed around her, she refused to be swept away by its tide. In her 60s and 70s, she remained as bold, opinionated, and scandalous as ever, clinging not to the memories of her past, but to the fierce ideals that had defined her later life. The way not to admit age, not to brand oneself as a back number, she declared, is to keep heart and faith and enthusiasms, but age has a way of chipping away at even the most unyielding spirits. Beneath her defiant exterior, the weight of loss and a fading world began to press harder on Daisy's indomitable will. Her husband, the Earl of Warwick, passed away in 1924. Though they had weathered years of estrangement and financial strain, his death left her alone to face a crumbling estate and mounting debts. Then came the more devastating blow. Her eldest son, Guy, died just 2 years later, estranged from his mother, drowning in depression and drink. The distance between them, a chasm widened by Daisy's controversial ideals and their clashing personalities, remained tragically unresolved. Despite her grief, Daisy pressed on, channeling her sorrow into purpose. She transformed Easton Lodge into a hub for the Labour Party, offering the house and grounds to the cause she held dear. Yet this grand gesture proved as ill-fated as many of her other enterprises. Labour's more austere members bristled at the mansion's degenerate luxury, as Beatrice Webb put it, with its over-furnished rooms and sprawling gardens filled with Daisy's bizarre menagerie of peacocks, ponies, and monkeys. Daisy herself, resplendent in corsets, picture hats, and opulent gowns, cut an incongruous figure among cardigan-clad socialists. To them, she was a relic of a world they sought to dismantle. But Daisy, undeterred, swept through her friendship garden, recounting scandalous tales of her love affair with Edward VII, pointing out heart-shaped plaques inscribed with the dates he had planted flowers for her. Even the great four-poster bed they had once shared was on full display, much to the mortification of her more prudish guests. In those years, Daisy became a caricature of herself in the eyes of many. Too grand, too eccentric, too much a vestige of a dying age. A young socialist recalled her sweeping into a room with her string of ill-tempered Pekingese dogs, her electric light smile flashing as she launched into impassioned speeches. Her gusts of temper were infamous, her charisma undeniable. And yet, beneath the larger-than-life figure, cracks were forming. A fire in 1918 had destroyed many of her treasured papers, including those she had hoped to use for her memoirs. She suspected foul play, whispering darkly that the palace had a hand in the destruction, just as they had fought to suppress Edward VII's love letters years earlier. Still, Daisy persisted. She published 2 volumes of memoirs, Life's Ebb and Flow in 1929 and Afterthoughts in 1931. Though selective and sanitized, they were her attempt to immortalize a life that refused to conform. About Edward VII, she was cagey, weaving tales of their friendship but leaving just enough unsaid to stir imaginations. Her socialism, however, she wrote about with fiery conviction, marveling at how far the world had come and lamenting how far it still had to go. By the 1930s, the world Daisy had known was almost entirely gone. Her peers in the aristocracy mourned the loss of their gilded privileges, but Daisy welcomed the egalitarian spirit of the new age, even as she lived its contradictions. Too fat to rise from her chair, she presided over Easton Lodge swathed in feather bows, eating hearty breakfasts of sausages and fish cakes. Her beloved menagerie of animals, dogs, cats, peacocks, pigeons, and monkeys, wandered her estate, a chaotic echo of her former grandeur. Eleanor Glynn, once her confidant in society's glittering heyday, wept at the sight of her. But Daisy, with characteristic defiance, dismissed the pity. "I am a very happy woman," she said simply. When Daisy died on July 26, 1938, the world barely noticed. She, who at the age of 3 had been an heiress worth £30,000 a year, left behind just £37,000 in property. And to her faithful housekeeper, the burden of 500 birds and 13 dogs. "I fear," her housekeeper sighed. "The dear Countess did not know it cost £8 a week to keep them." But Daisy's true legacy was not in her dwindled fortune or her eccentricities. It was in her unrelenting belief that the world could be better, more just, more kind, more equal. She had fought for causes that alienated her from her class and scandalized her society. She had endured ridicule, financial ruin, and personal tragedy, yet she never lost her faith in progress. Even in her final memoir, she marveled at the changes she had lived to see, writing, "The present generation will see, as I see, that conditions are far better for the great majority of people than ever they were before." we have made astounding progress. In the end, Daisy Warwick was not a relic of a gilded past, but a rebel who dared to dream of a fairer future. She lived not for the vanishing world of her birth, but for the ideals that outlived her. As the grandeur around her crumbled and the light of her age dimmed, Daisy's spirit burned on, a fierce, untamed flame against the shadows of time, illuminating the path for those brave enough to follow. I hope you enjoyed this week's video on Daisy Warwick. She truly lived many different lives, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about her. What part of her story surprised or resonated with you the most? A heartfelt thank you to everyone who watched, liked, shared, or subscribed. It means the world to us. If you're new here, we have 70 incredible women's biographies on the channel for you to explore. Be sure to check them out, let me know your favorites, and share who you'd like to see us cover next. A huge thank you to our amazing patrons, Velocity Girl, ZenLife68, Jillian Barker, Junie Moon, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kapham Chung, Harry Thurston, Karen Craig, Second Soprano 150, Michelle Lynn Neal, Bavia Andrea, Tracy Walsh Elizabeth, CTS Bathory, America Marie, Joy McGuire, Amber Perry, Amanda Lynn Snowball, The Inappropriate Hafer, Kendra McNally, Marianne Nelson, Deborah Shepard, Ida Kloster Jensen, and Kay Philomene. Your support keeps this project alive and ensures these stories continue to be told. Thank you for making it all possible. Congratulations to this week's trivia winners, Gertrude and Sharon Prevost. Well done. To everyone who stayed until the end and continues to be a part of this growing community, thank you. Your support inspires me every day. Stay curious, keep exploring history, and as always, thanks for watching.